deliberation. And so now I will turn this morning session over to Dr. Dayanan, who will be chairing the session, which is sponsored by the IDB, and it is centered around the Caribbean Quarterly Bulletin, which was recently released. So I'll turn it over now to Dr. Regan.
Good morning, everybody. All protocols observed. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As I was listening to the words of Sir Alison McIntyre, the words are timely, relevant, given the challenges facing the region. Certainly, the words raise the imperatives and challenges surrounding economic development of Trinidad and Tobago and the region in general. And he leaves us with some thought-provoking ideas on ways that we should explore moving forward. It is in this context, this issue of economic development, that I'm very pleased to bring you today and to join you guys today on this panel, Fiscal Policy in the Caribbean. And we have the makings of a very interesting panel by way of our members comprising the panel here. Let me take a moment here to introduce you to the members of our panel. First up, we have Mr. Moises Schwartz, who is the Regional Economic Advisor for the Caribbean Country Department at the IDB. Prior to coming to the IDB, Mr. Schwartz was Director of Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF. For several years, and he was also president of the National Commission for Retirement Savings in Mexico. He has a long list of qualifications and offices that he has held. He was also, importantly, director of macroeconomic analysis and director of economic studies at the Bank of Mexico. So we're very pleased to have Mr. Schwartz join us today. Our next speaker on the panel is Mr. Nirad Tewarie, who's no stranger within the local context. Mr. Tewarie is the CEO of AMCHAM. He's the CEO of Coalition of Services Industries. He's a lecturer at various institutions and here at the university as well, University of the West Indies. He's Adam as a journalist by profession as well. So welcome, Mr. Tewarie. And last up on our panel, but certainly not least in any way, we have our very own Dr. Terrence Farrell. Dr. Terrence Farrell, as you may know, is the head of the Economic Development Advisory Board. He was once, and a former hat, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. He has been admitted to practice law in Barbados and in Trinidad and Tobago. Is a certified mediator. He's a fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago, a member of Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Just to name a few of the hats that Dr. Farrell wears. His latest book, The Underachieving Society, Development Policy and Strategy in Trinidad and Tobago, 1958 to 2008. So we're very happy. Welcome, Dr. Farrell. Welcome to all panelists. Here's our plan. I want to get straight to the talks that are going to be presented today. We're going to have 7-minute presentations from each of our panel members here. Once they're complete, we're going to hold the questions. I know you might have many burning questions during that time, but we're going to hold the questions for a bit later. 7-minute presentations. We're going to have 10-minute discussion on a key thematic issue with our panelists, and then we will be opening up to the audience after that. So I'm gonna take my seat now, and I'm going to open up, invite Mr. Schwartz to make his presentation.
Hello. Good morning. Well, very glad to be here. It's really a pleasure to be here in Trinidad and Tobago and to be joined by this distinguished panel. I learned my lesson yesterday that you are very strict with the time, so I'll try to go straight to the point and give you some thought-provoking ideas. We are launching a report, the quarterly bulletin, that basically reviews the situation in the Caribbean. This is a publication we have had for some time, but this is actually the first time that we do a seminar. And basically the idea of having a seminar, in this occasion, hosted by you, and we appreciate that very much, is to stimulate some debate on issues that we consider relevant. Kamau is going to help me just to show a couple of graphs, just to emphasize some of the comments I have. So going basically to the main points I want to discuss this morning is that, as you are well aware, the Caribbean countries are small, open, highly vulnerable to external shocks. Debt levels are relatively high. We see no relief in sight unless some drastic policy adjustments take place. Another message, and I'm going to show you an interesting figure on that, is that even keeping current debt levels at their actual level requires an important fiscal effort, and debt levels are already high. Fiscal buffers, as we call them, and I'm also going to explain what I mean, are relatively low, and as a result, countries in the region are kind of constrained of using fiscal policy to implement counter-cyclical policies. While improvements on the revenue side are possible, and we have seen some in the region, we believe that expenditure needs to adjust even more. So these are kind of the basic points, and I'm going to emphasize a little bit more some of those. The first picture I want to show you is this one. This is kind of an empirical evidence that economists have seen all around the world. There is kind of this negative relationship between the ratio of debt to GDP and economic growth. You see the first part of the graph even shows kind of a positive relationship. So you could have small amounts of debt, and that kind of stimulates or is kind of complementary to economic growth. What this literature says is that once you reach the 30% level of GDP, you have diminishing returns to growth of having additional debt. And actually the slope becomes negative once you reach 60% of GDP. And as you can see, several countries in the Caribbean are on the right side of the curve. The blue square is 2017. The green square is the same country in 2015. So for example, if you see Jamaica, so we see a movement from the green to the blue. So that means a reduction in the debt to GDP. So they are moving in the right direction, but the level is relatively high. So high that impedes economic growth. You have other situations like Barbados that it's moving in the opposite side, increasing the debt to GDP ratio. The rest of the countries are in that part that we start having negative returns of having increases in debt, and that is why empirical evidence strongly suggests that countries should do as much as possible in order to reduce the debt, the fiscal debt. Another interesting figure, the next one please, that is okay, the previous one is okay. So this basically shows the same picture, the level of debt going from 2013 to going to 2016, and there is even a forecast by the IMF for 2020. So the Bahamas has increased its share of debt, Barbados has increased its share of debt, Guyana has marginally reduced it, Jamaica has significantly reduced it, Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago have increased from the last 3 years, they have increased their share of debt, which is certainly not good news. If we go to the next one, so I have two figures here. The first one is what I talked at the beginning of my presentation, which is kind of the fiscal effort you need in order to maintain debt levels as they are right now. So we are not saying that the levels are adequate, but even keeping those debt levels requires a significant fiscal effort. And this is shown by the horizontal arrow that you see. For example, Barbados requires a significant effort, several points of GDP in terms of primary surplus, in order to maintain debt levels as they are. Same is true in a lesser magnitude for Trinidad and Tobago, a little bit higher for Suriname. Jamaica shows the opposite. They have very high debt still, but they have had fiscal primary surpluses of about 7%. So if they were to maintain debt levels as they have those right now, they could get away without having a lower fiscal primary surplus of about 4%. That's not their plan. Their plan is to continue reducing debt. But the rest of the countries need a significant effort, fiscal effort in terms of the primary balance, basically to keep debt levels as they are. The one on the right side shows what we call fiscal buffers. And one of the main messages of this report is that fiscal buffers in the region are relatively low. And this is basically a combination of debt levels again, and primary surpluses, fiscal primary surpluses. So you see, for example, Jamaica has on the right side a significant primary surplus, but they are still very high in debt. Barbados, very high in debt and a marginal positive fiscal balance. But the rest of the countries here, in comparison to the other countries, they seem as if they don't have a debt problem, but they actually have a debt problem because it's a problem of the scale. But most of those are above 60%, which is a relatively high debt to GDP. And not only that, they have a fiscal deficit in terms of the primary balance. So that significantly reduces the possibility of using fiscal policy in order to face an economic shock. So that's a major message that we want to give to the audience. So what are the policy adjustments required? Basically, do something in order to improve the fiscal buffers. We have focused a lot in these countries in terms of revenues, and a lot has also to do with expenditure. So if revenues come down, as the case in Trinidad because of the shock to the commodity prices, so we would expect in tandem revenues to come down. It has happened here, but not in tandem. So it's difficult to do that, but it's perhaps required. If we can see the last figure, there is a map, and this is just an idea for you to keep in mind, and I'm about to finish. This is a map. The colored part of the region basically shows countries that have implemented fiscal rules. So in the Caribbean, you basically see the gray, so no fiscal rules with the exception of Jamaica. And I simply leave this thought in your mind that perhaps fiscal rules is something that the region should consider, and we can talk a little bit about the benefits if that's a topic that people would like to discuss a little bit, what the benefits are for the region and how can the region have a more positive scenario in the medium term if we were to have this type of rules in the future. So I would stop here, and sorry for breaching the timetable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. That's a very interesting presentation there, a very interesting talk, very important talk. Let me invite Mr. Tewarie to give his discussion.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hello? Okay. Morning. Thanks for having me. I hope that didn't come out of my time. I'm the only non-economist on the panel, so I will try to contextualize my comments. So, accepting that our revenues have fallen drastically, precipitously, and quickly, we accept that and understand that adjustments need to be made. But adjustments need to be made in the context of a growth strategy. So here are some of what we perceive to be the limiting factors. Government expenditure as a stimulation, as a means of stimulation of the economy has resulted in what you economists call a low fiscal multiplier effect, right? So it doesn't result in growth. We have this sort of up and down growth over the years, and particularly since, if you look at the last 15 years, it's very spiky. New taxes last year resulted in a net decrease in income taxes. It resulted in a net increase in corporation tax, but a net decrease in income taxes. And that suggests that the continuation of placing the tax burden on those who are already compliant is going to has already started to result in diminishing returns, and therefore has also a negative effect on competitiveness. As a result of that, one must question whether the budget numbers are realistic or not. And when the Minister of Finance will talk about having to run to the banks to pay public servants' salaries within the same week, it suggests that the numbers, the budgeted numbers, are not accurate and therefore result in cash flow crises, not even one, but several over the course of the period. If we are trying to return to growth and we're talking about changing the paradigm, you know what number strikes me in the budget? 0. And the budget, of course, is the context for all the discussions that we're having. Let's be real, right? Zero. Zero mentions of ICT, zero mentions of innovation, zero mentions of research. There is one mention of information technology in the budget statement presentation by the Minister of Finance. And we must be mindful of the implication of Petrotrin as a systemic risk to the economy and whether we are adequately preparing for that. And so when we look at those debt to GDP figures for Trinidad and Tobago, I think, and we think that they are way off. Our debt to GDP in real terms is much higher because, in effect, the sovereign has guaranteed the debt for a number of state enterprises. And that is something that we really must be mindful of. So, what are some thoughts around that? I mean, first and foremost, there must be policy coordination. All right? There must be, the implementation deficit must be addressed. The government, each ministry has to pick 2 or 3 key projects and get them done, and the government as a whole needs to figure out what their main priorities are, and we suggest, for example, the Revenue Authority can be one. It will result in a widening of the tax net and or an immediate increase in income, and let's work toward those projects so that we can see a sense of movement in the economy toward goals. The government also needs to work on the enabling environment for new industries. It doesn't mean spending billions of dollars on new industries. It means putting the correct regulatory and legal frameworks in place so that you can have the stimulation of new economies almost organically, but with a little bit of a push. Okay, that means greater adoption of ICT across the private and public sectors. The integration of customs into the single electronic window and the Revenue Authority will go a long way in that. The implementation of the procurement legislation with the associated units in the various state enterprises and government ministries. On the exchange rate, we all agree that the exchange rate is overvalued. I don't think any one of us thinks that a one-off devaluation is going to solve the problem. In the absence of adequate policy coordination, the issue of confidence will continue to force the dollar to slide where it's allowed to either devalue or float free. And so the issue of confidence must be addressed, because if the dollar is floated or devalued, and Dr. Farrell, I would love to be wrong on this, but if the dollar were allowed to float freely now, with the issue of confidence around the TT dollar and the future of our economy, everybody who can will flee to some safer currency or some perceived safer currency. And there is, I don't know where that will end, even if there's a steep depreciation or devaluation in the short term. And so we must address the issue of confidence, the development of capital markets, and opportunities for investments in Trinidad and Tobago. To do any of this, we need engagement and dialogue amongst the major actors, government, labor, civil society, and business. And it cannot be that one party or each party speaks at each other. Unless there's meaningful dialogue and engagement, we are not getting out of this recession in any time soon. Okay? So what are some possible solutions or sectors? I know the EDAB has done a lot of work on this. I think in the short term, and I'm talking about 2 to 5 years, the yachting sector, ICT sector, education services, health, energy services, and we need a high commission in Guyana to do that. Local conglomerates, yachting sector, ICT sector, education, health, energy services can yield us some significant foreign exchange, not to replace the loss of earnings from the upstream energy sector, but those can start netting us more foreign exchange in the very, very short term if we have coordinated policy and facilitation. And of course, the private sector in such context will need to act. We also need to be mindful that we've created a lot of local conglomerates. So some of these companies that you want to tax with the online shopping are local companies operating in multiple jurisdictions. And tax policy mustn't be seen as anti-business. You cannot treat the sectors that sustain your economy with disdain if you affect investor confidence. As of now, we have one upstream sanctioned project between Juniper, which is Angelin. We have plans by BP, Shell, BHP and DOG for drilling rounds, but those projects have not been sanctioned. And so if you scare off your investors at a time where you need it, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. Permit me just 30 seconds to talk about agriculture. I wholeheartedly disagree with the sentiments expressed by Sir Alistair McIntyre, with all due respect. We cannot be talking about agriculture in the context of land as the primary factor of production and be serious about a new economy. It has to be the adoption of technology and data analytics, integrated farming, hydroponics, and greenhouses, and that kind of high-end agriculture and agro-processing that will find niches in the global market and be competitive. And we cannot be talking about a strategy for development that moves our people around to go and work on farms as the primary strategy or a primary strategy. We should be talking about a new economy and how do we move our people around to work in high-end research, pharmaceuticals, ICT, healthcare, and so on and so forth. I'll stop there. Thank you for the additional time.
Thank you, Mr. Tewarie. Let me invite Dr. Farrell to give us a talk.
Thank you very much. Let me say, first of all, the question of fiscal rules, number one, these were proposed 15 years ago in Vision 2020. The macroeconomic subcommittee, which I chaired and incorporated in the final report, recommended that the country adopt fiscal rules so that we avoid the pro-cyclical fiscal policy that we've been doing for many, many years before that. Those have not been adopted, and we should have a discussion as to why they have not been adopted. The other point I would want to make is that our budget numbers, and what the point that Nirad made is that our budget numbers that we talk about all the time, the budget data are not transparent. The government continues until the last 50 years. We have been talking about these budget numbers as essentially cash flow numbers. The government needs to embrace the international public sector accounting standards so that we stop doing this cash flow accounting whereby we count as expenditure only whatever cash passes through the treasury. And we are not counting and not taking into account the liabilities, so that simply suppressing expenditure and deferring expenditure is not the same thing as cutting expenditure. Those liabilities accumulate and they remain for somebody to deal with down the road. In relating to that, of course, the question of the overdraft of the central bank. And it's an open question. I don't know the answer to the question, but I rather suspect that the central bank overdraft is not counted as part of the debt. And that's a considerable amount of money, actually. We need one of the sets of rules that we need to put in place is the rule around the heritage component or the heritage fund. We have recommended that the Heritage Civilization Fund be separated into two funds. As far as the Heritage Fund is concerned, our view is that the Heritage Fund is essentially an intergenerational. The Heritage Fund is an intergenerational transfer. That is what it's about, and therefore what goes to that fund ought not to be part of any particular budget in any particular year. So there is a statement in the current budget, in the budget statement of the Minister of Finance, where he suggests that what we have been doing is borrowing to save. I would want to suggest respectfully that that's not the correct perspective to take in respect of the heritage component of the fund. We need to reform the Exchequer and Audit Act, where everything that is generated goes into the consolidated fund. We need to, earmarking is a controversial fiscal rule where certain revenues are earmarked for certain kinds of expenditures, and that can be debated. But having said that, the Exchequer and Audit Act, as it is currently drafted back from the 1950s, is much too restrictive for a country operating in 2017. We also need what I would call micro rules, not just macro rules, so that Moises Mr. Schwartz talked about the 60% kind of tipping point for your debt to GDP ratio. Those are sort of the macro rules that we can talk about. But we also need to have what I think one can call micro rules that relate, for example, to the question of our subsidies. We pay a lot of these subsidies in the country, but I don't think, subject to correction, I don't think that the government knows exactly what are the impacts of those subsidies and whether or not those subsidies are having the intended effect. One of the things that happens here, and I spoke a lot about that last year at COTE, one of the things that happens here is that the government introduces a measure in year X, and in year X plus 10 or X plus 15, the measure is still there, and nobody is tracking whether or not it should be continued, whether it is having a beneficial effect and so on. So that we need to have some micro rules in respect of our subsidies, monitoring and evaluation of the subsidies, discontinuation of the subsidies, putting sunset clauses, for example, on the tax measures. I mean, one of the points that I would have made, for example, that Nirad made about the fact that the tax revenues were not, the tax measures were not generating the revenue intended, is that one of the things that you want to do in a period where everybody does in fact have to bear the burden of adjustment is that you want to say to the private sector, look, I'm going to increase your corporation taxes, but I'm putting a sunset on that. It's going to last for 2 years. After the 2 years, it's going to revert to the existing thing. What that does is that it signals to the private sector that, look, you're paying this additional tax for a reason and for a time. But when you increase taxes sine die, so that it's indefinite, then I think the private sector then starts to look at ways in which they can begin to avoid or evade that taxation and shifting the burden of adjustment. So that we need to have, I think, some micro rules as well in respect of the details of the budget, micro rules around transfers, around subsidies, and around expenditures. My final comments would be, are we likely to implement fiscal rules anytime soon? As I said, we've talked about it for 15 years. The problem is that what we have is that we have a rent-seeking society and a rent-seeking economy. And the budget is, what the budget does is that the budget takes the rents from the energy sector and distributes those rents to the rest of the economy through the budgets, through transfers, through subsidies, through the employment of public servants, etc. It also encourages political patronage. So that, the flip side of that is that it supports dependency and entitlement in the population. So therefore, it is going to be very, very hard to get politicians of any political party to adopt fiscal rules. It is not in their political interest to do that. They want to have the flexibility to be able to dispense political patronage, to subsidize those people that they want to subsidize, et cetera, because they want to get the votes. Now, to change that may require that in a period such as we are, that we have politicians who become somewhat more enlightened, that they experience a collective epiphany, that they begin to understand that this thing is not sustainable, and that therefore we need to have proper governance arrangements in respect of our fiscal operations, that we need to have delegation of authority within proper governance arrangements that would allow us to, in fact, adopt the fiscal rules that we would like to see implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for your presentation. I want to, you guys raised a lot of interesting points here. We had Mr. Schwartz talking about high debt levels, its relevance to the region. We see many countries, and certainly our own, going in that danger zone that he mentioned. And then we had Nirad talking about here the need for a clear growth strategy, and that the fact, hammering home the point that government spending is not necessarily the growth strategy that we think that we should have in terms of returns. And then we have Dr. Farrell here again talk about the need and issues, a few of the issues surrounding fiscal rules. Let me ask you guys, I'm opening it up to the panel here. On one side, we're talking about mitigating high debt levels, reining that in. What are the benefits? We've been talking about fiscal rules, but for the benefits of all of us here, what are the benefits of fiscal rules? I know Dr. Farrell has touched on some issues surrounding establishment, the fact that these things have been in discussion for the last 15 years. So how is it exactly that we do establish success stories from your international experience as well. Success stories in mitigating these issues, these challenges to implementing these rules. How do we get around to establishing them? And how importantly can we, given that there is a need, how do we move from where we are right now to implementing these rules? Let me open up to the members of the panel. Mr. Schwartz?
Sure. Well, Dr. Farrell already, thank you. Well, Dr. Farrell already mentioned some of the basics of fiscal rules, but just to have kind of a clear conception, I would say that there are very sophisticated fiscal rules and there are also very simple fiscal rules. Even having an annual budget is a fiscal rule because it tells you, well, I'm receiving these revenues, the government, how am I going to be spending those revenues? So this is already kind of a fiscal rule. Having a sovereign wealth fund is kind of a fiscal rule. So you save for the future or you use some of the proceeds to finance expenditures because revenues haven't been as high as you expected. So the idea of a fiscal rule basically gives some certainty to the policymakers and to economic agents in general. So there are no big surprises. So that's one of the main benefits of having a fiscal rule. At the same time, it imposes some constraints on policy making. So you could have a very tight fiscal rule that basically ties the hands of government, so you don't want to do that. You have to have escape clauses. So if there is a shock, if something happens, if revenues turn out to be significantly lower than what we anticipated because of a commodity slump, whatever, so you have these escape clauses. If you deviate from your target, so you could have a target on the deficit, you could have a target on the debt. There are escape clauses that you would say, well, I didn't attain the level I was looking for or the one I announced because of this extreme situation, but there is a plan. In the next 2 years, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in order to get back to track. That's basically the idea of a fiscal rule. It reduces the possibilities of fiscal mismanagement, I would say. It gives some certainty to economic agents. So those are the main benefits. And from the discussions we have had, I see that everyone agrees in terms of fiscal policy what needs to be done. The government, if I'm not mistaken, in the budget statement of last year, there is this commitment or this idea that the government should have a fiscal balance by 2020 and that debt to GDP should be below 65%. There is also the recognition by the government not to rely in the future on the sales of assets and privatizations and to reduce subsidies and to reduce transfers. So everyone knows what needs to be done. What I believe still lacks is the plan. How are we going to attain this? So if there is this idea of having a budget balance by 2020, it would be indicative to have some projections. So what should we expect for revenues next year? What should be the target for the fiscal balance in the next 2-3 years? So that provides some certainty, reduces the degrees of freedom of the government, but forces the whole society to move in a particular direction. So the only thing I'm suggesting, and it's not me, it's the experience from other countries that have done this, is that it provides certainty. Now, if you get into an extremely straight jacket, so that's certainly no benefit and no good for anyone. So there is the possibility of having some flexibility. At the end of the day, we have to have some flexibility, but at the same time, some understanding of where the economy is going.
So, to me, to add to that, one of the things that fiscal rules will do is it will force greater efficiency. Because if you agree to, if the government agrees to constrain its own spending and tie that to income, for example, it means that you have to achieve politically important projects potentially with less. And if you tie the minor rules that Dr. Farrell spoke about to metrics and performance, then again, it will help with efficiency, which is also, in my opinion, linked to the high levels of inequality that we have in the system, so that the amount that we spend on the things that are considered public goods does not actually result in a benefit, in particular, to the most vulnerable, whether it's education, health, or national security. If you look at those three ministries that receive the highest allocations in the budget, and you see who benefits least from that spend, it's the poorest in society. So it's a crime-ridden communities who have the least amount of law enforcement. And by law enforcement, I don't mean police coming in and knocking on your door and searching your house. I mean being safe in your house and being able to come outside at night. The lowest, generally speaking, the lowest levels of access to quality education and some of the highest rates of NCDs and lowest overall mortality rates in the country. And so if you tie what do you call them, minor rules, micro rules to macro rules, and you measure these things, you measure outcomes for spend, you will have increased efficiency and hopefully better value for money. And more equality.
Yeah. Great. I just want to emphasize a point that Mr. Schwartz made in his presentation, and that is that one of the things that struck me about there was a spotlight presentation before the budget, and there were presentations by the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank and so on the country's current circumstances. But what struck me was what was not there. And what was not there was exactly what Mrs. Schwartz talked about. There were no projections. And if you are saying that you want to get to a stabilized fiscal situation by 2020, then I would think that we need to know where you're going to be in 2018, where you're going to be in 2019, and where you're going to be in 2020. What are your revenue projections? What are your expenditure projections? And so on. So in other words, there's a medium-term plan that shows the population how you get there. We didn't get that. So we continue to kind of make it up as we go. For myself, I have a fundamental problem with the notion that you would want to achieve stabilization by 2020. I think it is too far in the future. My own view is that adjustment is something that needs to take place pretty quickly. And the reason for that, when I say quickly, because I'm talking about 18 months to 2 years. So from the time that we recognized that we had a problem in the second half of 2014, coming into 2015, I think at that point in time is when we needed to have started the process of adjustment. And one of the points that I would make about that as well is that we are focused here on fiscal policy and fiscal adjustment and fiscal consolidation, fiscal rules and so on. But there are two things that need to be fixed. One is the current account deficit on the balance of payments and the fiscal deficit. And to my mind, the current account deficit on the balance of payments is the bigger problem. It is the deficit that needs to be corrected and have the focus first and foremost, because we have an economy where the foreign exchange constraint is the binding constraint. So you could have a situation where I might get to fiscal stability, whatever you want to call it, or fiscal balance and so on by 2020, and I have no foreign exchange reserves. And if that happens, where are you going to be? So the adjustment that we are talking about has to be an adjustment that addresses both the balance of payments deficit, the foreign exchange constraint, most importantly, as well as the fiscal deficit.
You know, now this idea, we've been talking and focusing a lot here on fiscal rules, but there's a larger academic debate out there striking some balance in some sense between fiscal rules and the need for some discretion as well. When we look at small island developing states, prone to many shocks, higher volatility of shocks. And I mean, I know Dr. Farrell here talked about this is something that we've been discussing for 15 years. You know, so apart from our own local context here, the issues, challenges around actually implementing fiscal rules. But is there some room then to say, well, we need a certain amount of discretion, particularly in the context of small countries that face so many shocks? I mean, when we look at our recent experience over the last few weeks with hurricanes alone, what are your thoughts on that?
If I make one, then we can go back. No, absolutely. I mean, you can't put a politician or government in a straitjacket. You can't do that. And that's not the intention of having a fiscal rule. The intention of having a fiscal rule is to bring fiscal discipline to the management of government. That's what that was the intention. So that is one of the things that is uppermost in the minds of the people who are making policy, that I need to have a balanced budget, that my composition of expenditure needs to look this particular kind of way, that my subsidies need to be targeted and focused, and if they are not, I'm going to withdraw them. Those are the kinds of things that need to be uppermost in the minds of politicians. Where you have a rent-seeking society and the government becomes the main source of transfers to its constituents and to the people who vote for it and so on, and they're prepared to toss those rules out of the window and just simply do things from year to year based on current circumstances. So we had this situation here, just two stories. One is that the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, when it was instituted in 2005, 2006, was instituted with considerable opposition from the then Prime Minister, Mr. Manning. He had to be persuaded that this country needed to have a Heritage and Stabilization Fund, because the argument always was that, look, we have a lot of development things to do. We have roads to build and bridges to build and ports and airports and so on and so forth. And if the money is there, the revenue is there, let's spend it and get on with development. Why do you want me to park some of it in some other place? And it was done with considerable opposition from the then Prime Minister, but it was established. Having said that, under the last administration, when oil prices were in excess of 100 dollars a barrel, the last administration made no contributions, I think one contribution, to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund over that period of time, and ran deficits consistently for that period of time. Now, if we have a fiscal rule that talks about the importance of having a sovereign wealth fund, and that the oil and the gas which is coming out of the ground does not only belong to the current generation, but it also belongs to our children and our grandchildren, then you have to have sufficient discipline as a government to say, look, I am going to put some resources into a heritage fund, put some resources into a stabilization fund as a counter-cyclical policy, spend what's left in the most prudent and sensible manner possible, and when oil prices go down and when gas prices go down, I can use my stabilization fund to help to smooth the situation going forward.
So my answer to that question is yes and no. Yes, you need space. I mean, you wouldn't put a CEO to run a company and then tell them that their budget is fixed and inflexible. So you do need some space. However, the argument that we are, the constant argument that we are small and special and therefore mustn't abide by any best practice in the world, we must create best practice minus, I think is one which we have to start to get away from. We cannot be best practice minus as a starting point. So, right? And then if you look at that in the context of what Dr. Schwartz would have spoken about, where you start to get diminishing returns after debt to GDP ratios of 30% and you fall off sharply after 60%. That's what your data showed, right? Why is that? It's because what you start to do, I think, after 30% of debt to GDP ratios on a continuous basis, is you are subsidizing inefficiency. And if you subsidize inefficiency in the economy, then you are going to get diminishing returns. So you borrow to subsidize what? Government expenditure on personnel, government expenditure on pet projects, government expenditure on pet contractors and elements of the private sector, and you foster inefficiency. So fiscal rules possibly could help with some of that. So yes, you need some level of flexibility, but not because we're so special and so on. And a hurricane is, a hurricane like Maria or you know, Ivan is in fact a huge shock. And you can write something that will allow for that, as opposed to a tropical storm that causes some flooding in Maribel, and all of a sudden you decide, here what, let's break our fiscal rules for that.
Thank you. Well, I totally agree with the two panelists that have responded to your question before me. But I want to emphasize that fiscal rules are only a plan, and you could have flexibility in a plan. We all know that life is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. But we all have some kind of a plan in our minds. So we are in a university, and assume some students are listening, so they have a plan for their life. They want to be lawyers, they want to be doctors, so they have a future in mind. Economists. So you never know what life holds for you, but you have a plan. And the idea is to have some flexibility in the plan. Of course, what Mr. Tewarie was saying, the fact that these are small, open economies, vulnerable to shock, is not an excuse. Because you could always say, well, there's going to be a hurricane, and then whatever I do, so it doesn't matter. So why on earth should I have a plan? That's not a good excuse. But another point I would like to emphasize is that fiscal rules are not the solution. They are just an instrument to get from point A to go to point B. It's kind of a diagram. How on earth am I going to moving from point A to point B, and I let you know what I intend to do. At the end of the day, we need to put the house in order. So if a government is capable of having a fiscal balance, of making the difficult choices, having an efficient tax system, and so on and so forth, reducing expenditures, so you don't need fiscal rules. The idea of fiscal rules is that they give you this flexibility to deviate, and then you have a plan how you are going to come back to the point you want to get to. So fiscal rules have been developed in the past just as an aid to the government. So this is one way of being transparent where you want to be. But the basics of economics, we all know them. So we know what has to be done. It's difficult to do it. So it's not that the government in Trinidad decides, well, we are going to have fiscal rules and this is my plan, and that's the end of the story. At the end of the day, the difficult decisions have to be taken. Yeah. So that's a point I wanted to emphasize.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions. You know, and I think you guys have made some very important points here. Being small is not an excuse. There's a way to establish certain things, and even in the need for some discretion, but perhaps we need some rules concerning discretions as well. I am out of time in terms of my discussion with the panel, and I haven't been able to touch on a very important point that Mr. Tewarie raised, which is a growth strategy. But I'm going to turn it over to the audience now, open it up for you guys. I've had my fun in terms of